Jai Hind, Namaste, hello, and a very warm welcome to UPSC for everyone. My name is Abhinav, and in this video, we'll be discussing selected topics from the Hindu and Indian Express for the date 27th of September 2020. Now, in this video, we'll be discussing the following topics. About farm bills, so we will be discussing in detail the three farm bills, their implications. Basically, we'll be discussing about their implications, what the misnomers are, why people are protesting, why certain states are protesting more, what is the current state of the MSP system, how much uptake is done through MSP. We'll cover everything about the farm bills. Then COVID vaccine likely to cost between 140 to 210. This is basically a statement by SII, so we'll just look into that. Then CAG moots probe over cess accounting dodge. Now this is interesting news because it involves innovative accounting by the government, and this practice has been going on for the past 10 years. Basically, I have discussed already what is a cess. So cess is earmarked for a particular purpose, but the proceedings of cess were being transferred to Consolidated Fund of India to inflate the government revenues. So the money was being transferred from one head to another, and that the CAG has red flagged. Then the finance ministry made some statement, but CAG says that those statements are untenable and you need to fix responsibility whoever has done this. Then again, CAG coming down heavily on the government. PSU to PSU stake sale just moves funds to government. So basically, CAG has criticized the disinvestment policy pursued by government. So basically what government has been doing, it has been buying stakes in one PSU through another PSU. So what happens at the end of the day, the money goes to government, but government retains the ownership, and they call it strategic sale. So I will tell you what is disinvestment and what is strategic sale, and we'll also look at this issue and why CAG has red flagged it. Then India plans 4.6 billion per on EV battery makers. Now do you know, for an electric vehicle, up to 40 to 50% of its cost is only the battery, and that is what is the very important part about this news. So we will be discussing why India wants to pump up the battery makers in our country, what are the potential advantages and how it could help us. So we'll get into this news. Then using cloud computing for better flood inundation mapping. Very interesting news, a very little news, but it has implications for your geography, science and tech and disaster management. So little news, but many implications, and we'll see how these researchers have basically used publicly available resources to produce flood mapping, which is up to 94% accurate, and it can help us to basically manage or be prepared for the floods. So we'll see what this news is all about. Then Center for Early Rollout of Mother Tongue as Medium of Instruction. This is also very important. We'll see what the issue is. Basically, the government of Andhra Pradesh had made the instruction in English language as mandatory for school education, but then that was challenged in the courts. Then the Andhra High Court stayed it struck it down, and the case went to the Supreme Court. Then Supreme Court asked for center stand. So center is saying that we are basically wanting that instructions should be provided in mother tongue. We'll also see what is mother tongue, how many mother tongues are there in India. Then we'll also see what is a classical language, what are the classifications or the criteria for classifying a language as a classical language, and what does that status mean for that language. So we'll see all of that. And one more topic, we will be covering labor reforms. I'm sorry, it's not mentioned here, but we will also be covering the labor reforms that have been passed. We have already discussed them in detail in earlier videos, but we'll again have a relook at them. Now because news, they keep on rotating and rotating, so we have to keep revising and revising, but it will help you only. So these are the topics that we'll be discussing. Now let's get started. About farm bills. So the passing of the three farm bills has snowballed into a political problem, and it has also affected the farmers as is being claimed. And there was also a strike recently on these bills, against these bills. So we will discuss about the farm bills. I have already discussed the farm bills in detail with you in previous videos, but again to simplify the whole topic, I have divided it into a series of Q&As. That is question and answer. So in small parts, we will try to understand this issue. Only the relevant parts. We won't get into much technicalities because that is not required. So now there were many problems to begin with how the bill was passed, right? Now the opposition says that the bill was not forwarded to parliamentary committees to scrutinize the bill, which is a right thing. The earlier version, the 2019 version, was given to the parliamentary committees, but not the 2020 version. Then there was an issue about its passing in the Rajya Sabha. It was passed through voice vote, and I have discussed in detail the division of votes in Rajya Sabha, the whole procedure, the legal backing, and the relevant rules of Rajya Sabha that are applicable. If you remember, Rule 253 and 254 of the rules and procedures of Rajya Sabha. So we have discussed that as well. Now the main issue that is being highlighted these days is about MSP. So let me clarify in the beginning that MSP has never been legally guaranteed in India. So there is no statutory or legal backing for the MSP ever. So these bills also do not mention MSP, but that is an old practice because not ever has MSP been given any space in any legal parlance or any bill that has been passed. The PDS system was still given a legal status through the National Food Security Act of 2013, but MSP has no legal basis. It is just a scheme or a program that the government of India has been running for quite some time to support farmers. And how does MSP support the farmers? It basically sets a floor rate that below this rate nobody can buy the products from the farmers, right? Now I've also discussed with you in detail about the whole MSP process, that it is for 23 agricultural commodities and it is set by the Cabinet Committee on Economic Affairs on the recommendations of CACP. And I also told you the parameters that are taken into consideration for setting up the MSP, right? For example, that the MSP is 50% above, minimum 50% above the input cost that the farmer bears, and there are many more points that are considered before coming out with MSP. If you remember, there was also a point about intercrop parity, and I also told you how small farmers are net consumers, not net producers. So there has to be a balance between MSP and the affordability at the end user, right? We have discussed all of these issues in detail. As a matter of fact, we have also discussed the farm bills in details in previous videos, so you can go back and check those videos. Now again, we'll be discussing it, and I have simplified it. I will be telling you the main points of the three bills that basically alter the agricultural market. Then I will tell you why farmers have a problem, why states have a problem, right? As a matter of fact, I've already told you why farmers have a problem. Number one, they fear that MSP would be removed, right? Number two is that they fear that the big corporates that would set up in the agricultural market after the amendment to the Essential Commodities Act. So these small farmers would not have a bargaining power vis-a-vis the big corporates. Yes, that is their fear. Then the state governments, they have their own agenda. For example, they say that agriculture is a state subject, so center should not be making laws on that, number one. Then they say that since center is liberalizing the trade of agricultural commodities even outside the APMC mandis, so states would lose revenue because they levy charges and taxes on the sale and purchase of food grains or agricultural products within the APMC mandis. So they say they would be losing that revenue, and for states like Punjab and Haryana, that revenue is a substantial part. So I will also tell you why particularly the problem is in Punjab and Haryana, right? So let us see what this article is saying. We have discussed farm bills. I'm again telling you in detail earlier as well, but again we are going through it because this topic is in news, and this is to just dispel the myths about it. Now how it will pan out, how it will be in future, only future will tell, because any law or any new change that is brought into an economy, for example, the 1991 reforms, when they were introduced, there was a lot of resistance against those reforms. But today we can say that they were okay or good or whatever your point of view is. So similarly, it applies for the farm bills as well. They are being introduced Now let us wait and let us see. Now some people draw corollaries with the US market and the markets abroad. They have to understand that in developed countries, the corporate farming that they have, number one, for them, the farmer is not a sensitive vote bank, right? Number two, they basically promote farming, because if there was no corporate farming in countries like US, many people would not even be taking up farming, right? They want to promote farming because they want to engage some people into farming, because in future food would be a big necessity, and farming would be farming and global food industry would be a very big market in future. So they are just saving their markets. So let's not draw blind corollaries between US, India, or West and India, or what happened in which country. Yes, we can learn some lessons, and yes, those are the possibilities, but let's not just be so judgmental. Let us see what these bills do in the market, because there are people from both sides of the spectrum. Some say these bills are bad, some say these bills are good, some farmers are saying these bills are good, and except for Punjab and Haryana, there is not much resistance in other states. And some states like Bihar, Manipur, they don't even follow the APMC model. So this is a mixed bag. So let us just understand what these farm bills are all about. So what are the three bills? The three bills aim to change the way agricultural produce is marketed, sold and stored across the country. So let us just see. Number one is Farmers Produce Trade and Commerce Promotion and Facilitation Bill 2020. It allows farmers to sell their harvest outside the notified APMC mandis. As a matter of fact, only 6% of farmers actually sell at MSP at the mandis. So MSP as it is does not have that much of a relevance except for setting up a floor price. And similarly, in India, there are only 7,000 APMC mandis. So most of the trading already takes place outside the mandis, right? So let us see that it allows farmers to sell their harvest outside the mandis without paying any state taxes or fees. Now states have a problem with this because they would be losing their revenue, and some states like Punjab, they have invested heavily in the APMC infrastructure. They have made good roads to connect farmers with mandis, so they would be losing, right? Then the Farmers Empowerment and Protection Agreement on Price Assurance and Farm Services Bill. It facilitates contract farming and direct marketing. So again, this is both a good thing and a bad thing. How a good thing? Because in contract farming, the farmer would be getting a guarantee of purchase of his produce, and the company that is getting into the contract with the farmer would have to basically supply money plus inputs in the form of implements and fertilizers, insecticides, everything to the farmer. And they would also be guiding farmer how to grow the crop. And the risk would also be shared between the company and the farmer. And on top of that, farmer can even take loan on the crop that is being grown on the contract farming. As a matter of fact, the bill stipulates that the farmer would be the owner of the crop till the time it is not harvested. So it is both good and bad. There can be anything, like for anything in life, it can go both ways. So same is with this bill, right? Then the Essential Commodities Amendment Bill, it basically deregulates the production, storage, movement and sale of several foodstuffs, including cereals, pulses, edible oils, except in extraordinary circumstances. Now what happens when Essential Commodities Act is invoked? Then there is a ban or a temporary halt or freeze on trading in several commodities, especially the food commodities. For example, they could ban export of pulses or cereals or onion, which is a very sensitive thing, right? So if something is invoked in Essential Commodity Act, then that cannot be sold outside or have to be sold in a very limited quantity. So this limitation has also been removed, but it will be invoked only in extraordinary circumstances. So this is basically about deregulating and ushering in reforms in the agricultural sector. Now these are the salient features of the bills. I have discussed them in detail, explained them in detail. So please take a screenshot, you read them. Nothing difficult or rocket science about it, right? So this one is the Farmers Empowerment and Protection Agreement on Price Assurance and Farm Ordinance, and this is the Farmers Produce Trade and Commerce Bill 2020. This is about the Essential Commodities Act and the key features which I have already told you. So please take a screenshot and you read it, And if you cannot understand anything, please write in the comment section and I will be more than happy to help you out to understand those things. Now moving on. Now, do the bills talk about MSP? Please pay attention. No, none of the bills directly impinges upon MSP regime. As a matter of fact, like I have told you, no bill or law in India till date has ever guaranteed MSP regime. There is no legal backing to the MSP regime. So these bills also do not talk about MSP and no bill has ever talked about MSP, right? Now, how many farmers sell at MSP? Again, very important point. Only 6% of farmers actually sell their crops at MSP rates. This was given by Shanta Kumar Committee, which was in 2015, and it was on the basis of National Sample Survey data, which is again a government data. So these figures are very much legible. So only 6% of farmers actually sell their crops at MSP. Now a question arises that if only 6% of farmers are selling at MSP, then why such a hue and cry about MSP? Because for farmers, MSP is like setting the floor rate. This is the minimum and this is sort of a guarantee for a rainy day. That means that if nothing ever works out, they at least have the guarantee to sell at MSP to the government procurement agency, right? And I've also told you the whole MSP regime. First, central government comes up with MSP, right? Then state government comes up with another MSP, which is over and above the central government. So already the farmer is having a guarantee. Then the trader would be buying at a price higher than the MSP, right? And central government basically sets MSP at least 50% higher than the input cost of the farmer. So farmer basically gains because there is increment in prices at the MSP central, then MSP states, and finally the trader. So both of these basically set the floor for the farmers and the prices at which the grain can be sold. So that is a sort of a guarantee, and that is why farmers are worried that if MSP is removed, then they might lose that guarantee. But again, government has assured, the prime minister of a country has assured that MSP will not be removed. And since it has no legal backing, you cannot even take the government to the courts on a legal basis. Yes, you can go for fundamental rights and whatnot, but government has no intention of removing the MSP regime, right? And farmers are also fearing that government might reduce their uptake on the MSP regime. But if farmers are able to get better prices outside, they would themselves not be going to MSP. As it is, not many farmers go, right? So then what are the fears about MSP? For farmers, MSP signify the floor prices. I've already told you. Now, the important point about Punjab and Haryana, that most government procurement centers in Punjab and Haryana and a few other states are located within the notified APMC mandis. So this is where these states come in. That procurement occurs in the mandis, and these states basically they earn a revenue on taxes and handling charges. So I will tell you about them as well in a moment. Farmers fear that encouraging tax-free private trade outside the APMC mandis will make notified markets unviable, which could lead to a reduction in government procurement itself. So if there's a reduction in government procurement, then it can have a long-term implication on the MSP, and that is what the farmers are fearing. But let me tell you again, and I'm emphasizing it again and again, that these bills do not directly touch upon the subject of MSP. Now, farmers are also demanding that MSPs be made universal within mandis and outside. Now, this could be done, and it is a good demand, so that all buyers, government and private, will have to use these rates as floor price below which sales cannot be made. So this is a valid point, and government should really look at it as well. Now, why are protests vociferous in some states? Now, states like Punjab and Haryana, they have a very high uptake of paddy and wheat at the MSP level, and they also have elaborate systems of APMC mandis and infrastructure. So they are heavily invested in this system. That is why for them it would lead to a loss, especially in terms of the revenue that they generate through trade at the APMC mandis. And that is why these states have a much bigger problem in terms of changes that the system is trying to bring. And there are also issues about traders and definitions, some change in definitions. You don't need to know that. Just know that these states are the ones who actually stand to lose the maximum. So more than half of all government procurement of wheat and paddy in the last 5 years has taken place in Punjab and Haryana. Like I said, that major procurement at MSP takes place in these states only, according to Agriculture Ministry data. More than 85% of wheat and paddy grown in Punjab and 75% in Haryana is bought by government at MSP rate. So you see the importance. That is why more trouble in these states as compared to other states. Farmers in these states fear that without MSPs, market prices will fall, and this is also a valid fear given that MSP is removed. But as the Prime Minister has said in front of the whole nation that MSP would not be removed, so I think we should give him some credit. These states are also most invested in the APMC system with a strong mandi network, a well-oiled system of arthiyas or commission agents. Now see, these are old people in the sense that this is the old system and they have many deep-rooted interests that are at stake. So any old system would basically, they would resist any change, and they would be having big political contacts as well, right? And they would be financing political parties as well, even at the grassroots level. So there's a big system there. So if you try to disturb it, obviously there would be problems. Facilitating procurement and link roads connecting most villages to the notified markets and allowing farmers to easily bring their produce for procurement. So I've already told you that these states are heavily invested in the system. That is why they don't want any change to the system. The Punjab government charges a 6% mandi tax along with a 2.5% fees for handling central procurement. So see, like I told you that the majority or all the procurement in these states, Punjab and Haryana, takes place at the mandated APMC mandis, and for that central procurement, they have a tax or a fee of 2.5%. So this is how they gain, right? But if trading takes place outside the mandi, then such states would lose on a major part of revenue and earns an annual revenue of about 3,500 crore from these charges. So you see why Punjab is rattled. What are some other concerns? Now, like I told you in the introduction, that states say that agriculture is a state subject and center should not be making laws on a state subject because it basically infringes on their rights. So that is what the states are saying. Regional political parties and non-BJP state governments, they say that agriculture falls in state list, arguing that center should not be making legislation on this subject at all. So there's also heavy politics involved in this. They are concerned about the loss of revenue from mandi taxes and fees, which currently ranges from 8.5% in Punjab to less than 1% in some states. Such states as Chhattisgarh and Odisha, now they have seen recently in the past 5 years more uptake of paddy through the MSP system. So they are also somewhat concerned, have only seen procurement increase over the last 5 years after the implementation of decentralized procurement. Paddy farming has received a major boost with procurement at MSPs, and farmers fear their newly assured incomes are at stake because there's a wide scale notion or a narrative has been stated in the media or whatever that MSPs are going to go. So that is why these poor farmers are afraid of losing their incomes. And see, farmer is not at fault. The fault is of the parties that mislead the farmers, right? So how effective are mandis anyways? Now another important figure. A majority of agriculture marketing already happens outside the mandi network with only 7,000 APMC markets operating across the country. Like I told you in the introduction, Bihar, Kerala and Manipur do not follow APMC system at all, and they have agriculture system. So isn't agriculture doing well in these states, or are they not growing? Yes, they are. And that too without the APMC system. So see, there are vested interests who do not want any change. And as a matter of fact, the leading opposition party had proposed the exact same thing in their election manifesto, right? For the 2019 polls, they had the same thing in their election manifesto. And now they are trying to corner the government for bringing those reforms that they had promised, that the opposition had promised. So this is basically a political issue and doublespeak. I'm not dissuading the farmers' plight or their concerns. Yes, there are concerns and they should be addressed. But unfortunately, during these times in our country, everything has become bitterly political. Now, why the fear about corporate players getting into agricultural space? The removal of stock limits and facilitation of bulk purchase and storage through the Amendment to Essential Commodities Act could bring large corporate players into the agriculture space. Now, they will bring the much needed investment, and India badly needs it because our agriculture is still dependent on primitive implements and tools, and majority of agriculture is still dependent on monsoon. So these vagaries have to be removed. Now government has limited resources and the farmers have limited resources. So investment by private sector could bring in the resources and the money that is required to revive agriculture in India. They could also skew the playing field with small farmers unlikely to match them in bargaining power. Now this is also very true and a very valid fear. I'm not saying that this fear is not unfound. It can happen and it has happened in other countries, but let us give it some time and let us see. And our democracy is strong enough. If this doesn't work out, the government will surely lose the elections in the next term. Then the next government that comes, they can undo this, right? And state governments, they can help the farmers. So there are many ways. So, this issue has been made all the more political, but the real voice of farmers is not being heard. Now, how are the states reacting? Now, states like Punjab, they are basically trying to convert the entire state into an APMC mandi so that if agricultural trade happens anywhere within Punjab, then the Punjab government would be entitled to get the tax and the fees over it. So both Punjab and Rajasthan are considering legal measures to expand the bounds of their APMC mandi yards to ensure that they can continue collecting taxes on all agricultural trade within their state's boundaries. So this is all about the agricultural bill. I hope it is clear to you now. See, there are concerns and there will be concerns about everything and anything that happens in your life or in our country, but you have to look at the larger picture. Yes, there are fears that it may be misused or there might be disadvantages, but governance or management, it is basically about minimizing the immediate disadvantage or the long-term disadvantage and maximize the advantage, and every government takes decisions based on its own policies. So let us see how this really plays out. Let's not be naysayers. India plans $4.6 billion per on EV battery makers, that is electric vehicle battery makers. Now in an electric vehicle, the cost of battery is almost 40 to 50% of the cost of the entire vehicle. So this is very important to have an indigenous industry of producing the batteries for EVs, because not only it will promote the EV cars in India, but it will also create a very good space in India to emerge as an exporter of batteries. Now, why does India want to promote electric vehicles? Number one, the obvious reason, the environmental concern, right? And India is one of the few countries that is on its path to meeting its obligations under the Paris Climate Accord of 2015. So this is first reason. Number two is India wants to reduce its import bill, because India is one of the largest importers of crude oil in the world, right? So we lose lot of forex in importing this crude oil. Now this supply of crude oil is also affected by the vagaries of international geopolitical games that are played. For example, if there is a war, say in the Gulf region, then our oil supplies would be limited, right? So that is also a problem. So to have a strategic independence, we need to have something or a form of energy for which we are dependent on ourselves, that is Atmanirbhar. So we should be able to produce this EV battery system within India so that at least when it comes to passenger vehicles, India can be self-reliant in terms of the technology that we have, and we can also emerge as export players. And if we cut the oil imports, it will help our forex. And if we increase our exports of these batteries, then it will earn as forex, right? So our current account deficit problem will also be solved. So there are multiple benefits. In fact, Government of India has many schemes like FAME 1 and FAME 2 to basically promote the electric vehicles in India. Now problem is why they are not bought or what is the hindrance? Number one, the perception among people in India that these cars are not that good or they are not that efficient, but that has been proven wrong internationally by Tesla. And now good cars are coming out in the market, the good electric cars are coming out in the market. Number two, the issue is range. That as of now, the batteries, they only promise 480 to 500 kilometers, right? So this is good for within a city, but for those who travel on highways and who have to travel long distances, they have a problem. Number three is charging, because it takes time to charge an electric car, right? And at your home, your supply is the standard supply. So it takes a very, very long time to basically charge it. For example, you would have to charge your car or switch it to the charging point for the entire night before you can actually drive in the morning. So see, the ease of petrol and diesel is that you can simply go to a petrol pump and get your fuel. But such facilities are not widely available in India. As a matter of fact, their number is exceptionally low. And to set up electric car industry in India or a battery industry in India, you would need huge investment. So there is a problem of money as well. But you would be surprised to know that India is already a hub of sorts for developing of small cars, especially for developing countries. And also India is also a hub of two-wheelers that are developed in India and then they are sold across the world. So there is a big potential here. That is why Government of India is promising SOPs for EV battery makers. Now let us see what this news is saying. India plans to offer 4.6 billion in incentives to companies setting up advanced battery manufacturing facilities as it seeks to promote the use of electric vehicles and cut down its dependence on oil, according to a government proposal seen by Reuters. So Reuters is an international news agency. Now this proposal has been given by Niti Aayog. A proposal drafted by Niti Aayog said India could slash its oil import bill by as much as $40 billion by 2030 if EVs were widely adopted. But then again, the problem is widely adopted. India's efforts, what have been the efforts? I've already told you about the schemes. Now basically India's efforts to produce EVs have been stymied by lack of investments in manufacturing and infrastructure, such as the charging stations. This also I have told you. And if we look at the sales, so just 3,400 electric cars were sold last business year, right? And India is world's second most populous nation. In comparison to that, the conventional cars were sold 1.7 million passenger conventional cars. So again, these EVs are basically, they are technology disruptors. So when they come in the market, there would be a lot of resistance from the already existing players. So either they should adopt, and they're trying to adopt with hybrid technologies, and some of the established players are also bringing out their electric vehicles, but still there are some problems. And there's also a problem of, I can say, show off in countries like India. For example, you get an EV for 20 lakh rupees, right? So people would be more interested in buying a luxury sedan or a mid-segment sedan than to go for an EV. So there's also a very big issue of perceptions that has to be overcome before EVs can be largely normalized in a country like India. But if that happens, it will be good for us. China is already moving in that direction. It is high time that we should also think about moving in that direction. Center for early rollout of mother tongue as medium of instruction. So basically what happened, that in Andhra Pradesh, the government made English a compulsory medium of instruction for education. Now basically children there, they don't have English as a mother tongue, right? And for children, it becomes very tough to learn in medium other than mother tongue, because when they're taught in their own mother tongue, in the language that they speak at home, they are able to grasp concepts more easily than in a foreign language like English. So Andhra Pradesh government tried to do that. Then there was a case in the High Court. There was a petition against it, and the High Court basically struck it down. So Andhra government now made an appeal against the High Court ruling in the Supreme Court. So Supreme Court also involved center, and they asked what is their opinion on it. Now before we begin, let me tell you that Right to Education Act mandates that children should get their education, the primary education, as far as possible in their mother tongue, right? And the Constitution of India also says that children belonging to minority communities should get their primary education in their mother tongue. Now, unfortunately, in our country, we have been obsessed with the language of the colonizers. Even I am speaking in the language of the colonizer, right? I really wish I knew all the languages and I could communicate with every one of you in your own language. But that is unfortunately not possible because of the cultural diversity and the wide scale of languages that we have in our country. So English is like a lingua franca, right? And this also allows me to connect to my friends in South India and also in Northeast. So that is why I choose English as a medium, right? Now, coming back to it. So what happens when children, they are basically taught in English? Now, first of all, learning English in itself is a big or mammoth task for them, right? And then understanding things in English makes the matters worse, right? See, like I said, it is very easy for you to understand things in the terms of your own language, the language in which you are comfortable with, right? And language is just a medium of basically conveying or expressing your ideas. Yes. So this whole obsession with English in India is really bad. I hope this is changed, right? The only purpose that I see English serving in India is that it helps us connect across linguistic diversities. That is all. And also it helps us to actually be a good service provider in terms of KPOs, BPOs, etc. in the international market. But we should always take pride in our own language. Whatever your mother tongue is, you should always take pride in that. So this is the whole case that has been brought before the Supreme Court, and Supreme Court asked for Centre's response. So Centre basically said that even the new education policy, it emphasizes on multilingual culture and it emphasizes on mother tongue as a medium of instruction in schools. So let us see what this article is saying. The Union Ministry of Education, like I said, it was earlier the Union Ministry of Human Resource Development, but under the NAP, its name has been changed to Union Ministry of Education, has informed the Supreme Court that it is fully backing a push for mother tongue as medium of instructions in schools. The appeal was filed in Supreme Court by Andhra Pradesh government against High Court ruling to strike down its order to make English compulsory medium of instruction. Now, Ministry of Education stand. The use of home language for learning will bridge the gap between intelligentsia and masses. So NEP proposes it that if you use your home language or mother tongue, it will basically bridge the gap between intelligentsia and masses. Because unfortunately, again in India, we think if someone speaks fluent English, that means that person must be very intelligent, which is not at all that case. Or we think that if someone basically use big terms in English language, then that person must be highly intellectual. Again, that is not at all true. Remember the old intellectuals in India who basically in ancient India gave the concepts of cosmos, atomic theory. They calculated the distance of Earth from Sun. Did they know English? Not at all. Were they not intellectual? Exceptional intellectuals those people were, right? Did Gautam Buddha know English? No. Was he not an intellectual? He was a superior intellectual, right? So English or any language is not a test of your intelligence, is not a test of your capability, right? And this all again started with the British, right? Because it was the language of the colonizer. So if you have to talk intellectually, you should use English. And this is not a problem in India alone. This is a problem in many erstwhile colonies. This is where I basically appreciate China, that at least they have been able to throw that colonial yoke off of them. In terms of language, someday I will also tell you about the color theory and why people in Asia, they basically want to look fair. There are reasons for that. Now coming back to it. So ministry says that if you use home language, it will bridge the gap between intelligentsia and masses. NEP 2020 focuses on multilingualism. It recognizes the power of local languages to help young children learn and grasp non-trivial concepts more quickly. And this is also true, like I told you. Court is examining whether imposing English on a multitude of school children whose language of instruction is their mother language will amount to depriving them of an effective education guaranteed to them under Article 21. Yes, it does, because like I said, English is already alien to them. Now they have to understand other concepts using an alien concept. So can you imagine the paradox that is there in this whole system? So that is what is really stopping India from growing. there would be many intelligent, super intelligent children who, because of lack of language, are suffering. Now let us look at mother tongues in India. More than 19,500 languages or dialects are spoken in India as mother tongues. According to 2011 census, there are 1,369 rationalized mother tongues. Now, rationalized mother tongues means that such a mother tongue which is spoken by more than 10,000 people. So, more than 19.5 thousand languages and more than 1,369 rationalized mother tongues that are spoken in India. So, imagine the kind of linguistic diversity that we have in our country. Like any other diversity, we have a huge linguistic diversity as well. While there are 22 national languages, again 22 national languages in the 8th schedule or the official languages, but there is no de facto national language of India, right? These all are national languages of India under Schedule 8. There is only official language of India, that is Hindi in Devanagari script, but Hindi, mind you, is not a national language. Every language is equally superior and every language is equally good. Every language has its own beauty. So no language is superior, no language is inferior, no region is superior, no region is inferior. So getting back to the article, while there are 22 national languages in 8th schedule of the constitution, there are only 6 classical languages recognized in India. So let us see what are classical languages. What are classical languages? Currently, there are 6 languages that enjoy the classical status in India. All the classical languages are listed in 8th schedule of the constitution. Who provides guidelines for them? The Ministry of Culture provides the guidelines regarding classical languages. So how is a classical language recognized? It should have a high antiquity of its early texts, recorded history over of It should have a high antiquity of its early texts or recorded history over a period of 1500 to 2000 years. A body of ancient literature, texts, which is of considerable value, heritage by generation of speakers. The literary tradition should be original and not borrowed from another speech community. And the classical language and its literature being distinct from modern, there may also be a discontinuity between the classical language and its later forms or its offshoots. So these are the criteria which basically are the guidelines of Ministry of Culture to give a status of classical language in India. Now what are the benefits of classical language? Once a language is notified as classical language, the Human Resource and Development Ministry provides certain benefits to promote it. 2 major annual international awards for scholars of eminence in classical Indian languages. A Center of Excellence for Studies in Classical Languages is set up, and the UGC is requested to start with at least the central universities a certain number of professional chairs for the classical languages so declared. So we saw how you get the status of a classical language and what are the benefits of a classical language. Now at this point you must be wondering, what are the 6 classical languages? Well, let me tell you. So the 6 classical languages are as follows: Tamil declared in 2004, Sanskrit 2005, Telugu in 2008, Kannada 2008, Malayalam 2013 and Odia in 2014. So as of now we have 6 classical languages. What were the conditions? At least 1500 to 2000 years old. It should be unique. It should not be borrowing. There might be discontinuity between it and the modern versions, right? So these are the classical languages in India. And we also got to know what are the rationalized mother tongues in India, how many languages are spoken in India. That was a rough estimate because there would be many more, but that was as per the census estimates, right? So this is all about the language issue as a medium of instruction, and also you got to learn about the concept of classical languages in India. Now a quick news. COVID vaccine likely to cost between rupees 140 to 210. That is the statement by Serum Institute of India, which has begun phase 3 trials of its vaccine candidate, Covishield. We have discussed vaccines in detail, so I'm not going to get into it. This month has committed to producing about 100 million doses for India and 92 other low-income countries, partly aided by 150 million fund by Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation under Gavi. We have discussed all of this in detail in previous videos. I've also explained the phases of clinical trial, the time it takes, everything. From pre-trial to post-launch, we have discussed everything in detail. Half of those doses are expected to be available in India, though it isn't clear yet whether the vaccine shot would involve 1 or 2 doses. Now, the SIA vaccine has been developed by AstraZeneca and Oxford University, and we also covered the news that it was briefly paused because there were some adverse reactions in a patient in UK and there was one more case, but now the trials have been resumed. There are other candidates being tested by other Indian companies. Those in National Immunization Program will get it free. I've also discussed the whole National Immunization Program in earlier videos, Mission Indradhanush, the 12 vaccines, everything has been discussed. So that is why I'm not discussing it here again. You can go back to previous videos and you can find out all about the National Immunization Program as well. PSU to PSU stake sale just moves funds to government, says CAG. Now basically, in the name of disinvestment, the government has come up with a very ingenious way of accounting, you might say. What they do, they basically go for disinvestment targets, right? Now what is disinvestment first? That government sells off its stake in different companies, basically the PSUs, the public sector units or the public sector enterprises that are basically profit making. So to do that, government basically comes out with an IPO or an FPO or some other method to sell off its share of ownership in certain PSUs. Now, since past some time, the condition of economy has not then been that great. So what government was doing was that it was making one PSU to buy stake in another PSU. So ultimately, government was the owner of this PSU as well and this PSU as well, the largest owner, right? So now money was just being transferred from this PSU to this PSU through the sale of stakes. But ultimately, who was having that money? Only the government. So it is an innovative method of accounting and CAG has severely criticized this method. So let's see what the CAG report says. I've already discussed and explained about CAG in previous videos, so you can go and refer to them. The strategic sale of 4 public sector units to other public sector entities in 2018-19 by Centre has been sharply criticized by the CAG. It only resulted in transfer of resources already with the public sector to the government and did not lead to any change in the stake of the public sector government in the disinvested PSU, because ultimately government was owning the company which basically bought the stake. So ultimately government only bought that stake, right? And government got money from that PSU into its own coffers. In 2018-19, the government raised 72,000 crore from disinvestment, which included the strategic sales of Rural Electrification Corporation, Dredging Corporation and other companies. While REC was sold to PFC, DSI was sold something. The CAG now also criticized Centre's claim as disinvestment receipts of almost 12,500 crore from the sale of shares by Specified Undertaking of Unit Trust of India, an entity created to deal with the erstwhile UTI assets and liabilities. So basically they made us SPV or special undertaking out of the UTI, and then they said that this entity bought the shares of UTI. So that is a disinvestment receipt which the CAG has criticized and he has rejected those claims. The CAG said that adding receipts from it were wrongly booked as capital receipts. Capital receipts means that the one-time gain that the government is doing. So CAG rightly pointed out that these were not actually capital receipts but basically innovative accounting that the government is resorting to. Changes in labor laws. So basically, as a larger scheme of its reforms in the line of ease of doing business, Government of India has been making reforms in different sectors. So one of the reforms was also related to labor laws. I have already discussed in details the 3 new labor code bills, right? In previous videos, you can go back and watch. So I'll just give you a summary. So basically, Government of India had an agenda of integrating or subsuming 29 existing labor laws into 4 codes, namely Wages Code, Industrial Relations Code, Social Security Code and Occupational Safety, Health and Working Conditions Code. So these were the 4 codes: wages, industrial relations, social security and occupational safety, health and working conditions. So basically wages code was passed by the parliament last year. Now these three have been passed by parliament during this session, right? So we have discussed the features and everything. Now in this article, we'll again look at the features in a simplified manner. So let us see what this article is saying. So what are the main features of the Industrial Relations Code? It combines the features of three erstwhile laws: the Trade Unions Act 1926, the Industrial Employment Standing Orders Act 1946, and the Industrial Disputes Act 1947. Now let us see what are these. Now the new law defines worker. We have already covered that a worker is someone who's earning more than 18,000 per month, and it also defined the migrational worker under this work code, that anybody who is working in some other state than his home state and is earning less than 18,000 per month or up to 18,000 per month would be a migrant worker, right? So there's a definition of worker within the new labor code. It defines workers to include, besides all persons employed in a skilled or unskilled, manual, technical, operational and clerical capacity, supervisory staff drawing up to 18,000 a month as salary. So it basically includes everyone, whether skilled or unskilled, manual or technical, whichever capacity, but should be earning up to rupees 18,000 a month as salary. Then it introduces fixed term employment. It gives employers the flexibility to hire workers based on requirement through a written contract. So contract work is being formalized. It already exists in so many fields, and basically even the people who are working in software firms, they are working under contracts only. Even in government employment offices, so many places people are working in contracts. So this also brings the contract system or formalizes the contract system within the factories, right? So it gives the employers flexibility. Again, why flexibility to the employer? See, the government has to make a balance between employer and employee, because employer should have the flexibility. That is how we'll be able to basically attract investment from abroad, and I've explained the whole principle to you. So this is also in the line of ease of doing business. The fixed term employees, that is the contract employees, should be treated on par with permanent workers in terms of hours of work, wages, allowances and other benefits, including statutory benefits such as gratuity. So they will be getting all the benefits, but only till the time they are working. And if you see, again, I'm telling you, there are so many people who are working in software profiles and other profiles who basically work on projects, right? So that is also a fixed term employment. When the project finishes, their employment contract finishes, then that is renewed, right? So it is the same thing, that they would be working for a fixed term, but they would be allowed, or they would be treated on par with permanent workers in terms of all the working hours, wages, salary, benefits, etc. Then standing order. Standing order, I've also told you that any establishment employing more than 300 people or more on a daily basis for a period of 12 months, then they have to issue standing orders. That is, they have to specify the work conditions, the salary, the the leave conditions, etc. The shifts, whatever that would be happening, they have to specify. So any establishment that employs 300 or more workers must prepare standing orders relating to classification of workers, manner of intimating to them periods and hours of work, holidays, paydays, etc., shifts. So everything they have to put in writing, and they have to basically follow that. Attendance, conditions for leave, termination of employment or suspension besides the means available for grievance redressal, right? Then it gives the flexibility to government. So it gives flexibility to appropriate government. It can either be the state government or central government, who can basically exempt with or without conditions any industrial establishment or class of industries from all or any of the provisions of the code. Again, when the government at appropriate level, it thinks or it deems it fit that making a factory or establishing an industry is essential, so they can basically let go of these conditions. Then provisions on layoff and closure. Prior permission of government for layoff, retrenchment and closure are made applicable to only establishments that had employed 300 or more workers on an average working day in the preceding 12 months. So similar conditions to that of standing order. The code also allows government to raise this threshold by notification. So by notification means that government can only give out a simple notification. It does not need to go to the parliament. So it might happen that in future government might say that up to 1,000 employees or 10,000 employees, whatever the government says, and it will be through a simple notification, no need to get a parliamentary approval. Then it also deals with illegal layoff. A layoff would be deemed illegal if it is effected without permission or is done despite refusal of permission. But it will not be so if the employer had been offered alternative employment that does not require any special skill or cause undue hardship. So that means if you are firing an employee, but at the same time you are offering them alternative employment which does not require any special skill, that means they don't have to put any new efforts or any new upgradation, plus it does not cause them undue hardship, then you can lay them off without permission. Otherwise you will need permission, but that is for 300 and more the standing orders. Notice period. The code prescribes notice period or payment in lieu of notice period and prior government permission before retrenchment of anyone who has been in continuous service for a year or more. So if you are in a continuous service for a year or more, then you would be getting a notice period, and if not the notice period, then you would be getting payment for like 2 months or 3 months, whatever the notice period is, and you will be fired. So this is something that is already being followed in so many places, especially in corporate India. So that is also being brought down to the blue collared workers. Closure. Such a prior permission requirement is in place also for closure of a unit, with the application to be filed 90 days prior to the intended closure. So at least 3 months of notice you'll have to give to the government before you decide to close any industry. Now, how does the new code affect the right to strike? Now, this is interesting because it asks for basically giving a notice of 14-day and 60-day. This is something complicated. So let's see what this is saying. The code prohibits strikes and lockouts in all industrial establishments without notice. So without notice, you cannot go to strike. So number one thing is that you should give notice necessarily, right? No unit shall go on strike in breach of contract without giving notice 60 days before the strike. So you have to give a 2 months notice, or within 14 days of giving such a notice, or before the expiry of any date given in the notice for the strike. So basically, either you give a notice and wait for 60 days, or you give a 60-day notice, but within 14 days you go for a strike, or the period that is left between. So basically, it kills your right to strike. Further, there should be no strike during any conciliation proceedings. I've already told you, if there is a conciliation proceeding or arbitration proceeding, then during that proceeding and after that 60 days of that proceeding, you cannot go for strike. Or within 7 days of the conclusion of such proceedings or during proceedings before an industrial tribunals, or 60 days after their conclusion or during arbitral proceedings. So mumbo jumbo, just simply understand, number one, you cannot go to strike without giving notice. That notice has to be 60 days prior or within 14 days of giving the notice, right? And if there is a conciliation period, then, and if there's a conciliation proceeding, then during that conciliation proceeding or 60 days after that conciliation proceeding, you cannot go for strike. Similar restrictions have been given on the employer from announcing a lockout. So it balances. The employer also has to follow rules. He cannot just simply lock out factory and tell the workers to go. He also has to follow these rules for locking out the factory. The Industrial Disputes Act 1947 had placed such restrictions on announcing strikes only in respect of public utility services. Public utility services are those services which are of essential nature, for example, electricity, railways, things like that. But this present code extends it to all establishments. So public utility plus other establishments, all of them are covered under this new code. So you can just basically integrate what you learned here with the previous video and you have this whole labor issue in your hand. The simple thing again, basically 29 laws are merged into 4 labor codes, right? One was passed last year, 3 more now, and they basically deal with everything from firing, strike, layoff, everything has been dealt with these codes. And these all are a part of government's initiative for increasing the ease of doing business in India. CAG moots probe over cess accounting dodge. So I've already explained this again in previous video. It's not my fault. These issues keep on coming back again and again. So basically, first, what is cess? Cess is basically a tax on tax, right? And it is levied by the parliament for a very specific purpose, right? Like there was a GST cess, which was basically to compensate the states for the loss that they were going to take for accepting the GST regime, right? Now, whenever a cess is levied, it has to go to a dedicated fund. For every cess, a dedicated fund is created, and cess are not permanent, but they are temporary. That means once their purpose is finished, then those cess can be removed. For example, there is a 0.5% Swachh Bharat cess. So if we achieve the total sanitation and whatever the targets are within the Swachh Bharat ambit, then that can be removed. And that basically goes to a fund earmarked for Swachh Bharat Abhiyan. Now, CAG found out that basically government imposes cess on fuel, petrol and diesel. Whenever you buy, you pay a cess for petrol and diesel, and that has to be used for different purposes, for infrastructure development and all. So over a past decade, that is over last 10 years, that money has not been passed to the earmarked fund. Rather, the government of India has kept that money within the Consolidated Fund of India. I've also explained in previous videos what is Consolidated Fund of India, what is Contingency Fund of India, what is public accounts, right? Everything I've explained. So you can go back and refer to those videos. So basically, government did not transfer the cess to the earmarked fund, but to the Consolidated Fund of India, and that basically tantamounted to the accounts or to the revenue of Government of India. So CAG has raised objection over this accounting innovation again that has been happening, and it is not again related to particular government. It has been happening, for example, in fuel for the past 10 years and GST since the time of its inception, right? So let us see what the CAG is saying. The auditor wants officials investigated for incorrectly recording 10,250 crore of additional duties on petrol and diesel as non-tax receipts for the exchequer in 2018-19. This was done through a journal entry made after the end of the financial year, which the CAG said was done primarily for the purpose for artificially inflating revenue receipts of the year. So this is what has been happening. Now, one more thing, any tax or any cess can only be applied or imposed after the concurrence of the parliament. I told you under Article 267, any tax can be imposed by the parliament only. Now, Article 270 basically says that the cess does not come under the divisible pool, that is the tax receipts or the tax revenue that the center has to share with the states. Currently, it is around 42% as per the recommendations of 14th Finance Commission, right? So the cess receipts the government does not have to share, and government was basically transferring the cess receipts from that earmarked fund to the Consolidated Fund of India. The CAG also dismissed the Finance Ministry's explanation and rebuttals on the matter as untenable. Now, what was happening, that the cess for the fuel was collected under Central Road Fund created by Parliament. Like I told you that it can only be created by Parliament as a dedicated non-lapsable reserve fund to be used only for designated purposes. Now, what happened, that the Finance Ministry gave a notification and it introduced an amendment to the Union Budget, and it converted the CRF with a Central Road and Infrastructure Fund, CRIF, right? The Finance Ministry had argued that the idle balance in the CRF was transferred to the Consolidated Fund of India with the approval of Finance Ministers consequent to redesignation of fund from CRF to CRIF. So basically, they changed the name, transferred money from here to here, and then to Consolidated Fund of India. Now, the Finance Ministry says that such transfers have been made in past as well, right? And that had been done on the recommendations of the Standing Committee on Finance. Basically, these are committees which are multi-party committees. We have also discussed committee systems, right? So these have membership from across parties. So basically, in a way, it is to say that it had the backing of the parliament. Such write-backs had been done in the past also based on the recommendations of the Standing Committee on Finance, 16th Lok Sabha, for transferring unutilized funds, idle funds in the public accounts to the CFI. So this is the kind of innovative accounting that has been taken place, right? And I also told you that basically CFI is what? All the revenues that the government raises, the loans that the government takes, they all come under CFI. And any expenditure or any money raised apart from CFI, the routine small money goes to public account. So this dedicated fund was in public account and that was transferred to the CFI. So this is what has happened. Researchers have developed a tool for near real-time mapping of flood extent. So now this news is related to your science and tech, also to your geography, also to disaster management, also to urban floods, also to floods, that is geography. So small news but many implications. So let us see. So basically what researchers have done, they have used open source software or open source cloud platform and publicly accessible satellite data to basically make maps of flooding, that is where floods might occur, with an accuracy of over 94%, which can help predict the extent to which floods can occur so that we can make our plans accordingly to mitigate the effects of floods. So let us see. Maps showing where flooding may occur or flood inundation maps can help in better flood risk preparedness. Using openly accessible satellite data and a cloud computing platform, an international team has now developed a powerful tool for near real-time mapping of flood extent. So see, this is a very cheap method but also very effective. So what they have used, openly accessible satellite data plus cloud computing platform. Now the satellite data or the satellite they have accessed is a synthetic aperture radar satellite, which is basically a all-weather satellite. And India also has a SAR satellite called the RISAT. Now basically we use RISAT for spying purpose and it has been dubbed as the spy satellite of India. But it also has other implications like weather forecasting and flood inundation mapping. The paper published in PLOS ONE notes the new flood inundation map showed an accuracy of over 94%. Use of SAR, space-based sensors known as synthetic aperture radar, have been used widely for monitoring and mapping of floodwater inundation. SAR is capable of acquiring data in all weather conditions, making it useful for mapping and monitoring flood inundation areas. Now, the program they used was called Copernicus program. Now, what is this Copernicus program? Basically, it was a program launched by European Space Agency. And what they do, they operate sensors on the constellation of 2 SAR satellites, right? And using the data and Google Earth Engine cloud-based platform, they process their data and come up with the map. So let's see. The sensors operate on the constellation of 2 SAR satellites belonging to the Copernicus program launched by European Space Agency. The data from the satellites was utilized on a cloud-based platform known as Google Earth Engine for rapidly processing of big data. The GEE also has publicly made available numerous satellite image collections and has functions for image processing and analysis. So basically they use the Copernicus program of ESA and the 2 SAR satellites of this program, and they used Google Earth Engine, which is a cloud-based platform, for processing data from this Copernicus program, and they came up with their flood inundation map with an accuracy of over 94%. So this has high implications for India as well. So this is your science and tech and other subjects combined into one short news. So folks, thank you for watching. This is all for this video. I hope that this was helpful. Please subscribe to our channel if you like our videos and press the bell icon so that you don't miss out on any new notifications. And do press the like button if you like our videos. And please also connect with us on our Instagram page, UPSC for Everyone. See you next time. Till then, stay happy, stay safe, and have a great day. Namaste and Jai Hind.